Good morning, everyone. So before I get into the main talk, just like the least you need to know about our wonderful site here. Our lighthouse is over 160 years old. We're on 120 acres of property, part of the Bureau of Land Management's National Conservation Lands, one of 3 outstanding natural areas in the United States. It's not just the lovely spot here along the waterfront, it stretches north past Beach Road from US 1 to the Indian River. It is a unique spot here with unique history, a wonderful mix of history and nature. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around for more than 50 years, preserving and sharing the local history of Florida. People say, what is the mission you're trying to get across? What are you trying to let people know? And I think what it really boils down to is there is history in Florida before Disney and air conditioning. And in addition to all the wonderful acknowledgments from a little earlier, I just also want to acknowledge our site partners with the Bureau of Land Management, Peter here in the back with the blue shirt, and his interns help from the AmeriCorps, helping to set up the chairs you're sitting on today. So today's theme is natives. Native Americans are the most obvious thing you can talk about on that subject. We've had people living in Florida approximately 10,000 years, maybe even longer. Here in the Loxahatchee River region, over 5,000 years. That's just an amazing, that's before the pyramids, is something one of our local archaeologists likes to point out. And it's really appropriate because this site we're sitting on right now, stretching from over where they're building the bridge out here to the point where the rivers meet, a 1/4 mile long Native American shell midden from thousands of years of occupation of their living here. The site, it's a registered state archaeological site, Jupiter Inlet Site 2, 8PB 35, they've all got a number. And it's they didn't build the hill here is natural, not built by the natives, but something that they certainly made use of as a lookout point, probably a ceremonial site because the ridge naturally forms a crescent shape facing out to the sunrise. I'm sure they had some amazing sunrise services at some point in the past. And connected not just to this site, but the whole, what they call the Jupiter Inlet Site Complex. Across the river, visit Du Bois Park, see not just the amazing pioneer home that's there, but the shell mound that it sits on, 100 feet left from what was originally 300 feet of 30-foot tall shell mound looking out over the original Jupiter Inlet. Almost directly across from us at Sunny Sands, where they grapple with what the future of that site looks like. The Sunny Sands midden looking straight north up the Indian River. Getting a tour on that site after the trailers were out, that was one of the most eye-opening moments about that site's history and why it's at that specific spot. Be it to go up those historic stairs that used to go to someone's winter estate, but then you look due north and you are straight up that Indian River that goes on for 100 miles or more up toward Titusville and Cape Canaveral. The very waterway that they would have traveled on their canoes for thousands of years, and that was probably the greeting that people come in and okay, there is the civilization is directly before me. Up the river there used to be a shell mound at Sawfish Bay Park and countless other smaller sites around the Loxahatchee River all the way up into Riverbend Park, and they're doing work in the Loxahatchee Slough and finding sites where tree islands were occupied by native people for thousands of years. So the people all over the area, so much of it's been lost to our modern development that we've built over, bulldozed the sites where these native people lived. Many cases long before anyone really cared about it. It was just a pile of shell to get out of the way to build a hotel. And now we're more conscious about the need to preserve these sites, to study them, to understand them, to recognize their significance and what they represent. And from the native people to the people who came later, this has always been, especially in Florida, history shaped by nature. That was the tagline for our very first permanent exhibit in our museum 30 years ago or more. The river here, people who were stationed on this site in the Coast Guard in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the one universal thing they say, besides this was a lot nicer than Alaska, the fishing was amazing. And if the fishing was amazing here in modern development times, think about what it was like in the pioneer times or in pre-pioneer times, back thousands of years when it was just a scattered population of the native hunter-gatherers down here. They had to grapple with the water, but that water, without roads, planes, trains, automobiles, that water was their highway. Native people coming to build dugout canoes up the Indian River through a portage that we take a nice little canal on our boats down into Lake Worth. They had to portage it by hand over that ridge into the lake, but then through the waterways to Biscayne Bay, up the Loxahatchee River, before Wellington, before Grassy Waters, before Palm Beach Gardens, up the Loxahatchee River, into the Loxahatchee Slough, into the Everglades that took them into Lake Okeechobee, over to the 10,000 Islands, down the Caloosahatchee River, up the Kissimmee River to the Central Florida. They were inventive people. You know, people, especially in the past, have looked back and go, oh, these primitive people. They did so little. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have written language. But what did they need of those things when their transportation was water? You know, even the pioneers came down here and said the boats were more useful because it's just a sand pit out there trying to trudge around. They didn't have metal. They didn't have crops. They didn't have livestock. All the vegetables and fruits and animals that we associate with agriculture in Florida, they didn't have any of those to use. They had to adapt to what was naturally here. The fish, the shellfish that they used to make these mounds. The birds and flocks beyond what we can imagine today. Manatees. I had a field trip one time and I mentioned that, you know, back in the day you could eat a manatee, and they're like, oh, if we don't eat them now because they're endangered. If there was a healthy population of them, that wouldn't be a problem. Turtles, gopher tortoises, even the pioneers referred to them as Hoover chickens in the Great Depression. You can imagine the people here long before they did made use of them as well. Native plants, you know, all the plants that we associate eating with in Florida are things that have been brought here, but there are countless hog plum, cocoa plum, beautyberry, the palmetto berries. Jonathan Dickinson, when he was shipwrecked here, talks about, you know, how revolting to the European palate the palmetto berries tasted, but the native people that he met, you know, ate them by the handful with no regard to that. They found them quite tasty. So there's a lot of native plants here, native animals, the turkey and the deer, on land and in water, that they could live off the land, and they adapted to what they had. They worked out trade routes with their canoes to get tools from far away. You know, we found stone tools on this site through the archaeological work that must have come from North Georgia or even farther away. Shellfish from Florida and the Gulf has found its way to the Ohio River Valley. You know, these people were very inventive and creative and traveling long distances and working out elaborate collaborations, just like you collaborate today through this group and through your jobs. They collaborated with other tribes and other people. And because the people aren't here anymore, the original native people, the people that were here, the Hobe and the Hagwa, when the Spanish reached Florida, that fell victim to disease and warfare and slavery, they didn't have a written record to pass down. They don't have oral history they can pass down. We study sites like these. We perceive them through limited European eyes of people. The Spanish, Jonathan Dickinson's journal, trying to make sense of thousands of years of human life and what they were like with the limited resources that we can use to understand them and try to picture them and form them into a vision of full people and try to have an accurate vision and not a caricature, so we can understand what they were like and give them the credit they deserve. If you're a football fan, you know the Seminoles of FSU. I didn't go to UF or FSU, so I'm neutral in that debate. But the Seminoles are native peoples of Florida, but at the same time, they were the original transplants. Their ancestors largely came from what we call today Georgia and Alabama. Variety of Muskogean people moving into Florida where they had hunted and traded, perhaps fought, moving into vacant real estate. Sounds familiar? But back in the 1700s, in their mindset, they will tell you they've always been here, and to some extent that is true, and that they've been coming here for centuries beyond count, absorbing what was left of the native peoples from Florida into their tribe to make the Seminoles. That they would fight for what they saw as their native land for many decades, many of them in the end being sent to far from their native land to Oklahoma, but a few hundred very hardy, very determined people surviving into the Everglades when the government said, man, who would ever want to live in the swamp that is South Florida? And those few hundred Seminoles to endure, to survive, to grow, to adapt to tourism, to livestock, to ecotourism, to owning Hard Rock Casino today. A remarkable story of survival and success in the long run. They gave us Loxahatchee River, Lokahatchee, Turtle River in their language. Okeechobee, their name for the big water out there. Hungry Land, it's an English word, but it has Seminole origins of an area where they would struggle to find enough food. Indian Town, that's the Seminoles that lived in the area and came in there to trade. They would come into Jupiter. An important part of our pioneer era was coming in to visit the lighthouse keepers here, camp here, trade with them, and then when stores came to Jupiter in our earliest pioneer settlement, Seminoles coming in as a regular thing to come in and trade fresh meat, fresh skins, plumes to the general stores for manufactured goods, for rifles and ammunition and repair sewing machines and everything that they needed. Tequesta takes its name from someone who didn't know their Florida history very well, but there was a Tequesta tribe. They were not actually here in Jupiter, they were in Miami. Miami takes its name from people who lived out at the lake, but thankfully, like I said, Lake Okeechobee is named after the Seminole word because otherwise this would just become a confusing runaround. We even today, through the history of Jupiter Elementary School, Jupiter High School, their mascots are the Braves and the Warriors. How long that will last, there's been a movement away from having native-based mascots. They may not be that much longer, but that's what they've been as long as they've had mascots, going back to the 50s or 60s. Beyond the Native Americans, though, we here in South Florida, we're constantly really have to face the question of exactly who is a native. Do we mean people native to Palm Beach County? If you grew up over the county line, especially in Tequesta, are you still a native? Is it Florida that you're a native? You have to be a Southerner to be a real native? The Florida crackers that will trace their ancestry back to territorial Florida in the early 1800s will tell you they're the real Floridians. Do they just mean an American? How many generations back? That question of who is a native is hard to answer exactly what you mean. And is not being a native necessarily a bad thing? Our lighthouse here, this amazing piece of architecture that has stood the test of time and remains active today, designed by George Meade, improved by William Reynolds, built by Edward York and his crew. Not a one of them was born in the Florida or the South. They're all from Philadelphia. Our early lighthouse keeper, James Armour, 40 years a lighthouse keeper, one of the longest serving lighthouse keepers in the history of the American Lighthouse Service. Born in New York City in the early 1800s. One of the first Yankee transplants to the Indian River. In fact, none of our lighthouse our head keepers at least, from 1860 to 1919, not a one of them have been born, not in Florida, not even in the South. I don't think we had a head keeper in charge of the lighthouse born in Florida until the 1950s with one of the Coast Guard officers in charge. Henry Flagler brought his railroad to South Florida. The pioneers, they talk about in the newspapers of the time, so happy for Flagler to bring this railroad, connect them to civilization, have an outflow for their crops so they didn't have to rely on sailboats and steamboats and the temperamental inlets, the very reliable iron rails. Flagler's not from Florida, not from the South. He was the first person to start West Palm Beach in Miami that would grow far beyond what he could have ever even imagined. Here in Jupiter, one of our most important pioneer families, the Pennocks, Philadelphia Quakers, some of the earliest settlers of the colony of Pennsylvania. They came down here to revolutionize agriculture in the area by growing Asparagus plumosa fern, a non-native fern grown by people from Pennsylvania. who were Quakers and not Southerners, which means not only was their agriculture progressive and the biggest employer in town, their racial views were progressive. And their being here and employing people both black and white for equal pay, it didn't make this necessarily an equal community, but it spared us, I think, a lot of the horrible racial violence that much of the rest of Florida experienced at some point or another. Some of our most prominent families, the Carlin house across the river, the guy who ran the life-saving station, who Carlin Park is named after, born in the UK. Harry Du Bois built the Du Bois house, started Du Bois Park. His son ran the fish camp. Harry Du Bois was from New Jersey. Trapper Nelson, the wild man of the Loxahatchee, our living legend in our own backyard, born in New Jersey to immigrants from Poland to Lithuania. Burt Reynolds, besides Trapper, probably our most famous person ever associated with Jupiter. He grew up down here. He was born in Michigan. So many of the people that have been an integral part of the town were not from Florida, were not from the South. The Pratt Whitney generation, that group of people that started coming here in the late 1950s, early 1960s to work for that huge employer out west that's still there today, maybe not as big as they once were, but that was such an integral part of the growth of this community from less than 1,000 people in a small agriculture community into this 10,000 people in Jupiter to Cuesta, enormous by 1980. But they were the heart and soul of this community for decades, and the majority of the population, and almost all of them were from out of state, a lot of them from Connecticut. Yankees. Ooh. Today, we grapple with questions about immigration here in Jupiter. For over 30 years, we went from having almost no Hispanic population through Jupiter's history to having a sizable minority of mostly people from Guatemala of Mayan ancestry. They have probably more Native American roots than anybody else in town, but they weren't born in the United States, and how they get here, should they be here, how should they be here, those questions, in grappling in larger federal nationwide questions of immigration policy, happening in our own backyard and having to answer that question. In Western Jupiter, the Limestone Creek community, the black population was a third of the community before World War II. Today, it's now down to about 2% of Jupiter to Cuesta, but the people out there enduring in the Limestone Creek community, many of them have roots back to the earliest pioneer days. Probably a larger portion of their population has roots back to the pioneer days of Jupiter than the white population does. They have the oldest active church congregation in our area, going back 120 plus years now at Mount Carmel. So that question of who is a native is a thorny one. And it's not just about the people, it's about the plants and animals. This beautiful tree, our largest attraction here besides the lighthouse, both figuratively and literally, it is all one tree. This is not a native. It's been here since the 1930s, but it's a Ficus altissima, a council tree from Asia. But it behaves itself, so it gets to stay. I really sympathize for the folks in and for anybody who works in wildlife biology in South Florida. Every time I hear the subject of Australian pines come up and someone laments, I hate that they're removing them, they're so pretty, and they've always been here. And I shudder a little bit and feel sympathy for our biologists, because the Australian pines were brought in as decoration and windbreaks 100 years ago. They are from Australia. They are not real pines. They don't hold up to hurricanes. Out here on the site, the Bureau of Land Management a decade ago did such a fantastic job of wiping out this enormous Australian pine and forest and Brazilian pepper thicket. And you go out there, I encourage you, go out there when you have time, walk the nature trails, see the beautiful sand pine forest on the north side. It's beautiful, but if this was a much larger piece of property where it could have natural burns or prescribed burns, that beautiful forest might not be as thick as it is today, because they're supposed to be fire controlled. And you walk on the south side and you'll see how all the native plant life has come back in on its own, replacing the non-native Australian pines and Brazilian pepper, and how great of a success that has been. The hill behind us, now covered in this jungle of native vegetation, If you'd been here before 2010, it was overrun with Sansevieria, the snake plants. They still try to sneak back in on the edges along with some of the pepper. But to wipe them out and replace them with this lovely native vegetation that's been a success, not only to look nice and green, but to prevent the big sandy hill from washing away. And we've got all those lizards, the iguanas, the curly tails, the agamas, the basilisks occasionally were running across the water. All non-natives, and yet some people, there's a cold snap and they go, how do I save the iguana? It's so cool. Don't. Coyotes, non-natives to this area, once considered invasive in Florida, and it's at the point, they weren't introduced here. They just were very efficient scavengers, and all the other predators had been killed off, and they've been rather clever animals and have made their way here and integrated into the ecosystem. We just wish they wouldn't eat the baby gopher tortoises. And really the truest native beyond any plant or person, the alligators. They're remnants of the dinosaurs here in Florida. Scary, back in the tourist days, the people would come down here and their little mammalian brains would go, strange, ugly reptilian creature, must kill. Now they went to the brink of extinction. They've made their comeback. They're a remarkable creature to see, but we grapple on how many we should have around here and how we deal with them when they show up on our golf courses. But they're the truest natives we have. And people think that preserving the history of the area and preserving the wildlife, that's something that only native people can be inspired by, which is patently false. Many of you, who are non-natives who still love the area and want to see it cared for and preserved, but we can see it firsthand here through the history of our historical society. Bessie Wilson Du Bois, our first local historian whose amazing work laid the groundwork and the direct inspiration for creating our historical society, was born in New Jersey. She had grown up down here and married a local and came to see that the place was changing and that she wanted to preserve the history of what it had been so that people would always know, and she did a great job of that. Ethel Gravitt, who founded our historical society, inspired by meeting and listening to Bessie talk about the Jupiter's past, was part of that Pratt Whitney generation. She grew up in Kentucky. Looking at the history of our historical society for our 50th anniversary a few years ago, I was really amazed. We'd always hyped how it was people like John and Bessie and Anna Minear who had been such deep roots in the area. But the majority of our charter board, our charter membership, our amazing volunteer corps today and our staff, the majority of them have always been people who weren't born in Florida. But all those people from day one, people like Ethel Gravitt who said, this may not be my history, but it's history and it deserves to be preserved and we want to share it with others. And that's what really matters. Jim Snyder has written so many books on local history. He's a transplant here. Two people who did more than probably any other two people to save the Loxahatchee River, to prevent it from being turned into something like New River down in Fort Lauderdale, to help it become a national wild and scenic river and be the amazing river we can enjoy today, and that Benji can tell you, especially from his work, how amazing it is up there in the Florida jungle. Bill Lund, born in Palm Beach County to a father from Connecticut who came down here for the Florida land boom. Dick Roberts, 35 years with the Florida Park Service, grew up down in Coral Gables, but born in Ohio. Had never been to Palm Beach County until he got the job here in Martin County. And people say, the question of who is a native even circles back to me personally, because people will say, oh, how long have you been down here? Well, I've been here since second grade. I've been here for more than 3/4 of my life. Oh, you're a native. And if you're here, in 5 years, yeah, I seem like a native. And if you've grown up down here and you're 80, then you go, oh, you're just one of those newcomers. So I grew up in eastern West Virginia, born in Virginia. All my ancestors south of the Mason-Dixon line, but I don't really see myself as a Southerner. Am I a native? Is second grade long enough? I've been here in Jupiter since after I started working at the Lighthouse. I grew up in Martin County. Is that close enough to be a native? And maybe, in that regard, especially for my job, being only a quasi-native is how I like to put it, isn't such a bad thing. I don't have nostalgia goggles for what Jupiter used to be. I'm interested in it. I want to hear those stories, find that information, preserve and share that what it used to be, but I don't have, I'm not tied to it. I'm not, I'm not lamenting what it used to be from a first-hand account. I'm coming from the outside. I have essentially an almost unbiased perspective on it. It's history, it's interesting history, but it's not interesting because it's mine. It's not good or bad because of how I lived through it and it used to be. I'm just coming in and going, this is all, I want to collect it all and be able to research it and share it with you and everyone else so that we just can accurately know what it was like and we can make good decisions one way or the other, to change, to not to change, based on what it actually was. So that's the final thought I think I want to leave you with, of just history is amazing. Our local history is amazing. To learn about it, to educate yourself, and to make good decisions from that knowledge, regardless of what those decisions will entail. So thank you.